The grand ballroom fell dead silent as the most dangerous man in the city extended his hand to the one woman society deemed invisible. She looked the Mafia boss dead in the eye and said, "No!" He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in, his breath grazing her ear, and whispered slowly, "Mine." The annual winter solstice gala at the historic St. Regis Hotel was a viper's nest of inherited wealth, silent threats, and blinding diamonds. For Penelope Davies, it was nothing short of a gilded cage. Standing near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, Penelope adjusted the bodice of her deep emerald velvet gown. She was not a wayfish heiress. She was a woman of undeniable substance, her body soft, wide, and heavily curved. In a room full of size zero socialites who survived on champagne and sheer malice, Penelope's full figure, thick thighs, and plush hips made her an anomaly, a target for the cruel sideways whispers of the elite. She wasn't here by blood right. Penelope was the lead antiquities restorer for the Harrison Museum of Art. She was only invited because her meticulous, calloused hands had spent the last 8 months restoring a 17th century Renaissance masterpiece that was the crown jewel of tonight's charity auction. Did she mistake this for a plus-size bridal convention? A voice sneered loudly enough to be heard over the string quartet. It was Beatrice Kensington, a woman whose cheekbones were as sharp as her tongue. Beatrice took a deliberate sip of her martini, eyeing Penelope's thick arms and the lush swell of her chest with blatant disgust. Someone should tell the help that velvet is terribly unforgiving. Penelope kept her gaze fixed on the marble floor, her cheeks burning, though she refused to let the tears fall. She had spent her entire life navigating a world built for smaller women. She knew the power of her own mind, the brilliance of her work, and the undeniable beauty of her own skin. But in rooms like this, none of that mattered. Here, she was just the fat girl taking up too much space. Then the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The low hum of arrogant chatter evaporated into a heavy, suffocating silence. The string quartet faltered, playing a discordant note before hurriedly recovering. Penelope looked up, her pulse suddenly hammering against her throat. Lorenzo Costa had arrived. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman, though his name was plastered across the city's most lucrative real estate developments. The Costa Syndicate was an open secret. Lorenzo was the ruthless, uncontested head of the most powerful organized crime family on the East Coast. He moved with the lethal, unhurried grace of an apex predator. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo that stretched across his broad, heavily muscled shoulders, Lorenzo was terrifyingly handsome. His jaw was a hard slash of granite, his eyes a chilling, piercing amber, and a faint silver scar cut through his left eyebrow, a brutal reminder of the violence he commanded. Behind him flanked 2 massive men, their hands resting casually inside their tailored jackets, a silent promise of concealed weapons. Every woman in the room, including Beatrice, immediately straightened, adjusting their posture, desperate to catch the eye of a man who possessed limitless power and untold danger. Lorenzo had a notorious reputation. He was cold, unfeeling, and rarely made public appearances unless it was to assert dominance. Lorenzo's amber eyes swept over the glittering crowd with profound boredom. He bypassed the mayor, ignored a desperate wave from a tech billionaire, and didn't even spare a glance for Beatrice, who had practically thrust herself into his walking path. His gaze moved steadily across the room until it collided with the emerald velvet gown, until it locked onto Penelope. Penelope's breath hitched. She froze, her champagne flute trembling in her grip. Lorenzo stopped walking. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, stretching until it felt like a physical weight. The dangerous Mafia boss tilted his head slightly, his eyes tracing the line of Penelope's soft, full throat, dipping down to the heavy curve of her breasts, and sweeping over the wide flare of her hips. He didn't look at her with the polite disdain she was used to. He looked at her like a starving man who had just found a feast. Before Penelope could look away, Lorenzo changed his trajectory. The sea of wealthy elites parted for him like the Red Sea. He was walking straight toward her. Panic flared in Penelope's chest. "Why is he looking at me?" she thought frantically. "Does he know about the ledger?" 2 days ago, while restoring the frame of the Renaissance painting, Penelope had found a hidden compartment containing a small encrypted microchip. Unsure of what it was, she had quietly slipped it into her purse, planning to take it to the authorities. She hadn't breathed a word of it to anyone. As Lorenzo closed the distance, the heavy scent of cedar, expensive scotch, and faint gunpowder washed over her. He stopped mere inches away, his towering frame completely eclipsing her view of the room. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He exuded a dark, consuming heat. "Penelope Davies," Lorenzo said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sent a shocking jolt of electricity straight to her core. He knew her name. "Mr. Costa," Penelope managed to say, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the violent trembling of her hands. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink herself. She was a big woman, and right now, she used every inch of her presence to mask her terror. Lorenzo's amber eyes darkened with something akin to fierce approval as she held her ground. He didn't look at her body with mockery. His gaze was heavy, possessive, and entirely unhinged. "You are the most breathtaking creature in this room," he stated, not as a compliment, but as an absolute, irrefutable fact. A collective gasp echoed from the bystanders who were eavesdropping. Beatrice's jaw practically unhinged in shock. The Mafia boss, a man who had famously rejected supermodels and actresses, was openly admiring the plus-size art restorer. Lorenzo slowly extended a large, scarred hand toward her. He wore a heavy gold signet ring on his pinky. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. It was a command from a king to a subject. The orchestra, sensing the cue, immediately transitioned into a slow, haunting waltz. Every eye in the St. Regis was burning holes into Penelope's back. Penelope's mind raced. If she took his hand, she would become a target for every jealous socialite and rival criminal in the city. She would be stepping into a dark, violent world she had zero control over. Moreover, if he knew about the microchip she found, this was a trap. He was trying to publicly claim her, to isolate her, to take the encrypted files that likely belonged to his enemies. She would not be a pawn in a Mafia war, and she absolutely refused to be the punchline of a cruel joke for the elites watching them. She looked at his extended hand, then up into his dangerous amber eyes. "No," Penelope said clearly, her voice ringing out in the quiet space. Someone in the back actually dropped their glass. The shatter echoed like a gunshot. Lorenzo's hand froze midair. The 2 armed guards behind him instantly tensed, their faces shifting into masks of pure rage at the blatant disrespect shown to their boss. No one ever told Lorenzo Costa no. Men had been buried under the foundation of the city for lesser insults. "Excuse me," Lorenzo murmured, his tone dropping to a deadly quiet register that made the hair on Penelope's arms stand up. "I said no, Mr. Costa," Penelope replied, her heart beating so wildly she thought she might faint. She squared her soft shoulders, her emerald velvet shifting over her curves. I don't dance with men I don't know, and I certainly don't dance for the entertainment of a room that wishes I would disappear. For a long, agonizing second, Lorenzo just stared at her. The muscles in his jaw ticked. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Penelope braced herself for his wrath, preparing for the humiliation, or worse, the veiled threat. Instead, a slow, dark smirk spread across Lorenzo's face. It was predatory and utterly mesmerizing. He lowered his hand, but he didn't step back. He stepped closer. He invaded her personal space entirely, crowding her against the cold marble of the ice sculpture table. His massive chest brushed against the soft swell of hers. Penelope gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the overwhelming heat of his body enveloped her. He was so close she could see the golden flecks in his amber eyes, the exact texture of his scar. Lorenzo dipped his head, his face burying into the curve of her neck. He inhaled deeply, as if memorizing her scent of vanilla and old paper. The abrasive stubble on his jaw grazed her sensitive skin, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Mine," he whispered slowly, his hot breath ghosting over her earlobe. The word wasn't a threat. It was a vow. It was a brand seared directly into her soul. Before Penelope could react, before she could even draw a breath to speak, Lorenzo pulled back. His eyes were blazing with a terrifying, unyielding obsession. He didn't say another word. He simply turned on his heel and walked out of the ballroom, his guards flanking him, leaving Penelope standing in a state of absolute shock. The room erupted into chaos. Whispers broke out like a wildfire. Beatrice glared at Penelope with a mixture of envy and pure hatred, but nobody dared approach her. Lorenzo Costa had just publicly marked her. Shaking uncontrollably, Penelope grabbed her clutch and fled toward the exit, ignoring the blinding flashes of the society photographers at the door. She had to get out of there. She hailed a cab in the freezing New York winter night, giving the driver the address to her small walk-up apartment in Queens. As she sat in the back of the cab, clutching her purse to her chest, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Mine. The word echoed in her mind, but the real twist of the night wasn't Lorenzo's terrifying declaration. As the cab pulled up to her street, Penelope saw the flashing blue and red lights. Her apartment building was surrounded by police cars and fire trucks. Her unit on the 4th floor was engulfed in raging flames. Standing on the sidewalk across the street, illuminated by the fire, was Thomas Redmayne, a corrupt NYPD detective known to be on the payroll of the Rossi family, Lorenzo's deadliest rivals. Thomas caught her eye from across the street and smiled a sickening, victorious smile. They weren't after Lorenzo. They were after her. And the microchip in her purse was the only thing keeping her alive. Lorenzo hadn't just claimed her out of twisted desire at the gala. He had whispered "mine" to warn every enemy in that room that if they touched a single hair on Penelope Davies's head, he would burn their world to ash. She wasn't just a restorer anymore. She was the most protected and hunted woman in the criminal underworld. The flames consuming Penelope's apartment cast a hellish, flickering orange glow against the icy windows of the yellow cab. Penelope sat paralyzed, the brutal reality of the criminal underworld crashing down on her. Detective Thomas Redmayne's sinister smile across the street was a promise of violence. If she had been home, if she hadn't been delayed by Lorenzo Costa's terrifying display at the St. Regis Gala, She would be burning right now. "Driver!" Penelope choked out, her voice trembling as she clutched her small, beaded purse to her chest. "Keep driving. Don't stop." But before the cab could even shift into gear, 3 matte black Cadillac Escalades swerved around the corner, their tires screeching against the frost-bitten asphalt. They boxed the taxi in with military precision, cutting off every angle of escape. Penelope's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled for the opposite door, but a massive figure blocked the streetlight outside her window. The cab door was yanked open with a violent wrench of metal. Lorenzo Costa stood there, the winter wind whipping the edges of his unbuttoned Tom Ford overcoat. The faint scent of gunpowder and expensive cedar flooded the cramped back seat. His amber eyes, usually so cold and unreadable, were blazing with a volatile, lethal intensity as he assessed her, searching for any sign of injury. "Get out!" Lorenzo commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left absolutely no room for debate. "No," Penelope gasped, pressing herself against the far door, her fingers digging into the plush velvet of her emerald gown. "You brought this to my door. You put a target on my back." Lorenzo didn't argue. He leaned into the cab, his massive frame dwarfing the space. With terrifying ease, he wrapped one heavily muscled arm around her thick waist and hoisted her out of the vehicle. Penelope gasped, her soft curves pressing against the hard, unyielding wall of his chest as he carried her to the center Escalade. He deposited her into the back seat with surprising gentleness before sliding in beside her. The doors locked with a heavy metallic thud. "Drive," Lorenzo ordered. The convoy sped away from the burning building, leaving the corrupt detective and the wailing sirens behind. Penelope shrank against the leather door, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. "Where are you taking me? Why are you doing this? I didn't ask for your protection." Lorenzo turned to face her. In the dim light of the street lamps passing by, the silver scar through his eyebrow made him look like a fallen angel. "You didn't have to ask, Penelope. Redmayne is on Giovanni Rossi's payroll. They know you found the microchip inside the frame of the Artemisia painting at the Harrison Museum. They were going to torture you for it, and then they were going to kill you." Penelope froze. "How do you know about the chip?" "Because the painting belonged to the Rossi family," Lorenzo said softly, his gaze dropping to her trembling lips before meeting her eyes again. It was a dead drop. Giovanni Rossi has been using the art world to launder billions and smuggle encrypted data detailing his blackmail on federal judges, senators, and police commissioners. Your boss, Arthur Pendleton, is deeply in debt to the Rossis. He acquired the painting specifically to extract the chip for them. But you, with your brilliant, meticulous mind, found it first. Betrayal twisted like a knife in Penelope's gut. Arthur, the man who had mentored her, who had smiled at her every morning, had sold her out to a crime syndicate the moment she stumbled upon their secret. "So you claimed me at the gala," Penelope whispered, the realization settling over her like a heavy shroud. "You humiliated me in front of all those people, put a mark on my head, just to use me as a shield to get to the Rossi's blackmail files." Lorenzo's jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered beneath his stubble. Suddenly, he moved, closing the distance between them. He crowded her against the leather seats, his large, calloused hands coming up to frame her face. His thumbs brushed over her full cheeks, his touch surprisingly reverent for a man who ordered executions before breakfast. "Do not insult me by thinking you are merely a pawn," Lorenzo murmured fiercely, his amber eyes burning into hers. "I knew about the chip, yes, but I could have sent a team of mercenaries to take it from your apartment while you were sleeping. I didn't need to walk into a ballroom full of vipers and claim you in front of the entire city." Penelope's breath hitched. "Then why?" "Because I have been watching you for 6 months," Lorenzo confessed, the raw, unfiltered truth bleeding into his tone. "Ever since I saw you sketching in the Renaissance wing of the museum, I watched those skeletal, empty women look down on you, unaware that they were standing in the presence of a goddess. I watched you carry the weight of their judgment while possessing a mind sharper than any blade I own. I wanted you then, but I am a man of darkness, Penelope. I knew my world would destroy you, so I stayed away." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "But when Arthur told Giovanni you found the chip, you became a target. The only way to keep you alive was to let the underworld know that your life was tied to mine. I whispered mine, because you are. The chip is leverage, but you are the prize. And I will burn New York to the ground before I let a single flame touch your skin." Penelope's heart staggered. For her entire life, her size had made her invisible to the kind of men who ruled boardrooms and society galas. She was taught to hide her curves, to apologize for the space she took up. But here, in the back of a speeding SUV, the most dangerous man on the East Coast was looking at her thick thighs, her plush hips, and her soft stomach as if she were a Renaissance masterpiece herself. He didn't want her to shrink. He worshipped her magnitude. "I have the chip," Penelope said, her voice finally steadying. She reached into her beaded clutch and pulled out the small metallic square. "If it destroys the Rossis, take it." Lorenzo looked at the chip, then back to her. "When we decrypt this, Rossi will know. He will come for us with everything he has. Are you ready for war, Penelope?" She thought of Beatrice's sneer at the gala. She thought of Arthur's betrayal, and of her home burning to ashes. Penelope lifted her chin, her green eyes flashing with a newfound, dangerous fire. "I'm tired of running," she said. "Let them come." Lorenzo's sanctuary was a sprawling, ultra-modern fortress, hidden deep in the Catskills, surrounded by acres of snow-covered pines and a small army of heavily armed guards. For 3 days, Penelope lived in a world of staggering luxury and high-stakes tension. Lorenzo treated her with a dark, obsessive devotion. He dressed her in imported silks that clung to her lush curves, fed her decadent meals, and spent hours listening to her talk about art history, genuinely captivated by her intellect. Every look he gave her was filled with unapologetic hunger, erasing decades of insecurity from her mind. Meanwhile, Lorenzo's tech team breached the microchip's encryption. The files were a gold mine: offshore accounts, wiretap transcripts, and video evidence of Giovanni Rossi paying off high-ranking officials, including Detective Redmayne. But Giovanni Rossi was a desperate man, and desperate men made reckless moves. On the 4th night, Penelope's burner phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, but the syntax was unmistakably Arthur Pendleton's. "Penelope, please. They have my daughter. They say they will kill her if I don't bring you to the old Chelsea piers at midnight to trade the chip. Forgive me." Penelope showed the message to Lorenzo. The Mafia boss stared at the screen, a chilling, dead-eyed calm washing over his features. He strapped a custom 1911 pistol into his shoulder holster and adjusted his tailored suit jacket. "It's a trap," Lorenzo said flatly. "Arthur doesn't have a daughter. Rossi is using him as bait." "I know," Penelope said, her voice cool. Over the last few days, she had absorbed Lorenzo's ruthless pragmatism. She wasn't the scared girl in the emerald dress anymore. "So we used the bait to catch the shark." Midnight at the Chelsea piers was freezing. the air thick with the smell of brine and rusted iron. The Hudson River slapped against the decaying wooden pilings. Penelope stood in the center of an empty warehouse, the cold wind whipping her heavy wool coat around her full figure. She was terrified, but she held her ground. Headlights cut through the darkness as two SUVs rolled into the warehouse. The doors opened, and a dozen armed men spilled out. Among them was Arthur Pendleton, bruised and trembling. Behind him walked Detective Thomas Redmayne, holding a suppressed pistol, and finally, Giovanni Rossi himself, an older, gaunt man with lifeless, cruel eyes. "Well, well," Rossi sneered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The little art restorer who caused so much trouble. Where is Costa? Did he abandon his new toy once he realized she was too heavy to carry?" The Rossi men laughed, a cruel, grating sound. Penelope didn't flinch. She stared Rossi dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of Lorenzo's dark authority. "He didn't abandon me," Penelope said smoothly. "He's just letting me do the honors." Rossi frowned, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "Give me the chip, you fat cow, or Redmayne puts a bullet in your knees." Redmayne raised his gun, aiming at Penelope. But before his finger could even brush the trigger, the warehouse erupted. High-powered sniper rounds shattered the windshields of the Rossi SUVs. In the span of 3 seconds, half of Rossi's men dropped to the concrete, neutralized by invisible shooters perched in the steel rafters. The remaining men panicked, firing blindly into the darkness. From the shadows behind Penelope, Lorenzo emerged. He moved like a ghost, his amber eyes locked onto Rossi with the promise of absolute death. Behind him, 30 of the Costa Syndicate's most elite enforcers stepped into the light, their weapons drawn. "You stepped into my city, Giovanni," Lorenzo's voice boomed, cutting through the gunfire like thunder. "And you threatened what is mine." Rossi, realizing he was catastrophically outmaneuvered, grabbed Arthur Pendleton by the collar, pulling the terrified museum director in front of him as a human shield. "You're dead, Costa. If I go down, the police commissioner will wipe your family off the map. I own this city." Penelope stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Lorenzo. "Not anymore," she said. She pulled out a small, remote detonator-style button and held it up. 10 minutes ago, before we arrived, I sent the decrypted contents of that microchip to a secure server at the FBI field office, directly to an incorruptible federal task force Lorenzo helped me identify. The commissioner is currently being arrested in his pajamas. Your offshore accounts have been frozen. You have nothing." Rossi's face drained of color. His empire, built over decades, had been dismantled by a woman society told him to ignore. With a roar of fury, Redmayne swung his gun toward Penelope. Bang! Lorenzo didn't even blink. His weapon fired with terrifying speed. Redmayne's gun clattered to the floor as he collapsed, clutching his shattered shoulder, howling in agony. Lorenzo's men immediately swarmed, disarming the rest of Rossi's crew and ripping Arthur away from the mob boss. Lorenzo walked slowly toward Giovanni Rossi, his gun lowered but his presence suffocating. He grabbed the older man by the lapels of his coat, lifting him slightly off his feet. "The feds are 5 minutes away," Lorenzo whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life in a concrete box, and every day you rot, you will remember that you were destroyed by the woman you underestimated." Lorenzo tossed Rossi to the ground like garbage. Sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing off the water. Lorenzo turned back to Penelope, the violence draining from his eyes, replaced instantly by that deep, burning devotion. He offered her his arm. "Shall we go home, Mia Regina?" he asked softly. Penelope looked at the flashing red and blue lights approaching the pier. She looked at the men writhing on the ground, the empire that had just fallen at her feet. She took Lorenzo's arm, her plush curves pressing against his side. "Yes," she smiled. "Take me home." The annual spring gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was in full swing. The room was dripping in diamonds and old money. Standing near the bar, Beatrice Kensington was halfway through a snide remark about the floral arrangements when the room fell dead silent. The string quartet faltered. Walking down the grand staircase was Lorenzo Costa, looking as lethal and beautiful as ever. But the city's most dangerous man wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking only at the woman on his arm. Penelope Costa was a vision. She wore a custom, blood-red silk gown that hugged every thick curve, every plush inch of her hips and bust, unapologetically celebrating her size. Around her neck sat a diamond necklace worth more than the entire museum wing. She walked with the confidence of a queen who had conquered the dark, her chin held high, radiant and powerful. As they reached the ballroom floor, the sea of elites parted instantly, bowing their heads in fear and respect. Beatrice practically choked on her champagne, shrinking back into the shadows. Lorenzo pulled Penelope into the center of the room. He wrapped his large hands around her waist, pulling her heavy curves flush against his hard body. The orchestra, trembling, began to play a slow waltz. "They are terrified of you," Lorenzo murmured, kissing the shell of her ear as they swayed perfectly in time. Penelope laughed softly, resting her head against his broad chest, feeling the heavy gold signet ring on his finger press against her back. "They're terrified of you, Lorenzo." "No," the Mafia boss whispered slowly. His amber eyes filled with endless, consuming worship as he looked down at his wife. "They know I rule the shadows, but they know you rule me." Can you believe that incredible twist? Penelope didn't just survive the Mafia war. She orchestrated the downfall of Lorenzo's enemies and claimed her throne as the undisputed queen of the underworld. From being mocked at the gala to ruling the city, her revenge was absolute perfection. What did you think of Lorenzo's fierce, obsessive devotion to her? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this story, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe right now for more thrilling drama.